Hey, thanks for joining us on another Adventure Box podcast. We're so excited to get started because today we're going to be talking about the birth of a nation. That's right, we're going to be talking about the birth of the United States when we first began. This is like never done before in all of history, the way that we've done it, the way that the United States did this. Now, interesting enough, there have been other ones that have done other things, which are great, but everyone is unique. So when we're trying to set up a country, like not us, but our founding forefathers, our founding fathers, we'll say, when they are trying to set up the government, they're starting from nothing. They have some ideas from former governments. They have people like Locke who taught them some things about democracy and such. There's a lot of different influences, and there's a lot of different people and a lot of different opinions on how this should be run. So you think that we're like at each other's heads this day and age? Actually, it was a lot worse back then. You had two different sides, or at least you had multiple sides, but two major sides. One was the anti-federalists, and one were the federalists. We had people that wanted to have the government could basically control everything, almost like a dictator or a monarchy, much like England. And you had those that did not want it. They wanted more to be on the states' rights. So how do you bring these together? Now let's first, before we get into this, let's go back. Let's go to how this all began. How did we actually get to this point? Do you remember French and Indian War? Yeah, that played a huge part. Because as the French and Indian War was happening, and around that time, you had the King of England sending over all these different proclamations and acts. These are taxes. These are rulings that he made that the United States people, the colonists, the British colonists, because they were the British colonies, had to live by. Well, those are people like, oh, you know what? That would be fine. Now, again, I'm going to go through this. They were fine with it. They would not have actually gone up in arms if this big part, if they actually had representation in Parliament. Now, they did actually have a lot of people in Parliament that actually sided with the colonists, but they did not have any representation specifically from the colonies. So the French and Indian War was actually the start of what would become the American Revolution. Now, there was a big gap between the two wars, but it's because there's a lot of things that were happening in between that actually started up, again, the American Revolution. First thing that the British had to do was they had to push out the influence of the French. They had to make enemies with the French, which would come to their demise when the French would join the United States during the American Revolution. So, in that sense, the French and Indian War started it off. And the British wanting to control everything that was happening in the colonies, also part of it. Then you get into the American Revolution. American Revolution is fought everywhere from the north up to Canada, all the way down to Georgia. Now, remember, at this time, you basically have the Spanish that still have an influence in Florida. It is British. There's a cooperation, we'll say, between the two. So not much fighting actually happens in Florida itself. But I'm not saying any. I'm saying much. But here's the big thing, is that between the fights up in the north, where it all started, and then coming down to the south and ending in the south, remember, the very final battle, the final major battle that happened was in Yorktown. Yorktown was in 1781. Now, again, the war started, like Stand and Concord, 1775. This is 6 years later. Think of being in war around where you live for 6 years. As an actual person living at the time, think of worrying about the soldiers coming through, that they're not going to bring another set of soldiers from the other side and start attacking each other in your own city or in your own town. Everyone was up in arms. Everyone was frantic for the next 6 years. Talk about the anxiety that's happening today. These kids don't know anything about anxiety when it comes to the anxiety that was actually pushed on the people in the colonies, because they had literal war around them. Well, most of the people that have anxiety have it internal, and there's more, I believe there's more stress, anxiety, depression than there has ever been. But truthfully, most of those people that have depression don't actually have to worry about the roof over their house, over their head. Most. I'm not saying all. Most. They don't have to worry about eating every day. They don't have to worry about an army coming through and taking over their city. They don't have to be worried about being shot by well, okay, maybe there's a few school shootings. There's neighborhood shootings, which are even worse, that happen all the time. But they don't have to worry about a war happening in their city where they're more likely to be shot if they stayed in the city and they had to evacuate. So there's so many things going on. And then 1781, Yorktown, done. It finished. And the people could take a breather. Now, the treaty doesn't actually get signed until September 3rd, 1783. Two years later, sorry. 2 years later. Now, with those 2 years, you had people like Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, who were actually negotiating inside of Britain, trying to get them to agree on a treaty. It was, they could take Canada. They could take all that land up in Canada. That's theirs. The United States, the colonists are going to take the colonies all the way down to Florida. So all of this land is going to be theirs. Now, you also had the Native American influence as well. So we had to figure out a way of making it so that the Native Americans could actually play a part in this treaty. So all these things had to be considered. That's why it took 2 years. Nothing happens overnight. Because remember, it's not just the fact that they can't make a decision or that they have to debate forever. No, it's the fact that you can't communicate. If someone in the United States wants to communicate with Benjamin Franklin, who's over in England or France, he has to send a ship over. That ship will take 3 weeks to get over to England. The fastest it's ever going to be about 3 weeks. They get over to England. They have to find Benjamin Franklin, and then Benjamin Franklin has to bring it to the negotiation table. It's a long process. So during this time, there's actually a few battles. We talked about this last week. A few battles that are still fighting inside the United States. Very little. Mostly they're loyalists trying to establish themselves or get away from the colonists, and the colonists are going straight for them. The patriots, or those that were against the crown. So with all this being understood, it was the treaty that finally made America independent. It recognized, it gave Britain the ability to recognize, or the documented, the written agreement that America is independent from anyone else. This actually started off everything from the French Revolution and their independence, and so many other independent movements throughout the South. Now remember, let's see, I think this is around the same time that Mexico is actually having their independence from Spain. So there are other independence that are happening. But I think those two are basically the ones that really spurred it for everyone else. Now, the treaty also had to basically set up perimeters. Okay, I already mentioned Canada all the way down to Florida. But at the same time, it also had to go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. Remember, New Orleans is actually on the other side of the Mississippi River. It's still considered Spain. Well, Spain/France, because France sold it to Spain. Spain, they wanted their land, so after a few battles, they were actually open to battles being in the American Revolution at the end. They were actually open to giving up Florida and New Orleans if they were given the Caribbean. Spain wanted the Caribbean because that's where most of their crops were still. They had so much slavery down there and so much production that was going on. They said, you take New Orleans, it's a swampland, don't care about it. You take Florida, don't care about it as much. I mean, that it was actually some farmland, but it was also swampy land. We take the Caribbean because we're well established there. And they saw inevitably they would lose it as well. So at this point, you have a little bit of a breather. 1783. Britain is taking care of their stuff. America's taking care of their stuff. Spain and all those other countries are taking care of the Caribbean. I mean, it's a mixture of all different people. So for the first time, the U.S. is truly independent, and this young nation has now been given the assignment to begin to govern itself. Now, they actually were governing themselves a little bit before that. Let's go into what's called the Articles of Confederation. So, first off, and then we're going to actually go back to this period of time, 1783, but we're going to go a little bit back because the Articles of Confederation were actually designed by the Second Continental Congress in 1777, but it wasn't even ratified until 1781 when they had won Yorktown and the war basically ended. That's when all the colonies could agree that they're going to work around the perimeters of the Articles of Confederation, as flawed as it was. Yes, the Articles of Confederation were very flawed. So the Articles created what they call a unicameral legislature. Unicameral. Try to remember that name. Legislator. This means they had a Congress, but they did not have an executive branch, so no president, and they didn't have a national court. Now, some people would like to say, well, we had a president before George Washington. Well, that's not true. He was the president of the Congress, president of the unicameral legislature, the central government, though weak, the central government of the colonies. They had very limited federal powers. They could declare war, they could sign treaties, they could even print money, but they could not tax, and they could not regulate trade. Okay, so how do you bring money into the United States if you don't have taxes and if you can't do tariffs? That means no money except for whatever the states or the colonies at the time were creating. So if the colonies were making it and the Continental Congress said, okay, 5% of whatever you make has to go to us because we have to run this government, then these states can say, well, I'll give you 3%. I'll give you 2%. I'm not giving you any money. So there was no strength in the central government. There was no money behind it. That was a lot of the issues. But if they were going to pass laws that fulfilled all the colonies, you needed 9 out of the 13 states. Now, let me ask you this. How many do you think were actually slave states? Answer is probably about 5 or 6. But there were no set laws outside of the, well, and even in the Articles of Confederation. There were no laws on slavery, so anyone could have them if your state allowed it. So the supermajority, 9 out of 13 states, 9 out of 13 colonies, had to agree on whatever they wanted, whatever the group wanted. It also means you need to have at least 9 of them there to have what you call a quorum, which means you couldn't even hold Congress unless there's that many people there. And a lot of times they didn't show up. Now, we're going to get into the new Continental Congress later on. We're actually not going to get into this week because the next thing we need to talk about, not today, on Wednesday, is how do you fund a country like that? You can't. There is literally no way of funding a country if the federal government has no rights to tax or to regulate trade, because those are the 2 ways that you can make money, except for getting money from the states. And if this, colonies, I'm going to keep doing that, the colonies are not going to give you the money unless they really want to, because there's no laws on it, unless there's a 9 to 13 agreement, which is also, if you wanted to get rid of slavery, not going to happen, because again, 9 out of 13 states had to agree on it. Again, 4, 5, or even 6 states still wanted slavery. So now let's go a little bit more into winning the war. So there was successes of the article. The article basically guided the Americans through the final years of the war, basically how you ran things, which is why the Articles of Confederation was a great thing. It was written so that they could actually run a temporary government while they were fighting the British. When 1781 came around, it was ratified, but by 1783, when the treaty came out, it was not worth the paper it was written on to some extent. It still kept the country together. Now, what about land ordinances? So, again, this is the success of the Articles of Confederation. Another thing that the Articles did is the land ordinance of 1785. Now, this is actually afterwards, but allowed them to actually hold this in the Articles of Confederation. So Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now, this created a system of settling and governing new Western lands. Remember, none of them are states. Until the Constitution is ratified, none of them are states. They're all colonies and territories. So how do you control where settlers go during this time? And how do you work out the relationship with the Native Americans during this time? Because you have no rules when it comes to that. Okay, now let's talk about the failures, because we're already talking about that a good amount. We're going to go over 3 main failures: economic problems, foreign affairs, and internal conflict. And this is going to bring up one of the big ones that I want to discuss today. And I think it's today. No, actually, maybe it's on Wednesday. Let me double check. Yes, we're going to be talking about this more on Wednesday. And this is the internal conflicts. Although we'll mention right now, because I'm going to talk about the failures of the Articles of Confederation. First one, the economic problems. Without the power to tax, and we've already gone over this, Congress could not pay war debts or even fund the government. So it wasn't just funding the government. It was the fact that they had racked up so much debt, including that to France, by not having a way to tax their people or tax the trade that's coming in. So that was one of the biggest failures of the Articles of Confederation, because at the time that this was written, they weren't cared about taxing the people. They didn't care about trade because they didn't have the control to do any of those things. Now they have. So without the power to tax, Congress couldn't pay for its debt and couldn't pay the government. Next, interstate trade was also chaos. Again, during the war, when they wrote this, they were not worried about the trade between the different states and the rules there. And how about a currency that was equal between them? One of the biggest failures of the Articles of Confederation. Those two. Okay, let's go into the foreign affairs. Now, the British refused to leave their forts in the West. Spain blocked American access to the Mississippi River, New Orleans. They still haven't given it up at this point. They're going to, but they have not at this point. So, the foreign affairs issues mostly were between the British and the Spanish. I know we talked about that in the beginning of this video. British, Spanish, they were basically keeping them, I guess the British would be over here. Well, I guess in your view, it'd be over here. Anyways, so the Mississippi River cut off basically where the treaty said you can have that land. Everything east of the Mississippi. Everything west of the Mississippi, it's free game. So any British forts that they had in the west was still theirs. So they could do whatever they want in those forts. Another thing, the Mississippi River had a lot of goods going up and down the Mississippi River. Anything from fur traders all the way up to Canada, all the way down. Problem? Well, if the U.S. government wanted to be able to have access to that river and be able to send it out to the ocean, they had to take it over New Orleans. That wasn't going to be done quite yet. Okay, internal conflict. So, again, everyone was up in arms about taxing, because they couldn't tax. Spending, they couldn't spend. Debt, they had a ton of it. And also the fact that there were no laws when it came to settlements and how to pay up mortgages and such. The British pound was basically gone. How do you run a country if there is no currency? Well, since we're all used to it, there's no way. A long time ago, rocks sometimes were currency. Paper, printed paper, were considered currency. Precious metals were currency. Not during this time. Now, you could, if you had gold, you could buy things. And it was probably the only way of really knowing that they actually had a value. But there was no currency. Again, we'll talk about that on Wednesday. The next thing. Next thing I want to bring up. Well, you know what? So that's some of the issues with the Confederacy. Let me go over just one more thing when it comes to after the treaty. So there are major impacts because of the treaty. So first, for the first time, well, no, we already went over that. The first time U.S. could see independence. So they had control over doing this. These are the things. So there was actually a lot of struggles that were happening after the war did not have to do with Articles of Confederation. One was trade, and that did have to do with it. National debt, again, it was a sore subject that needed to be talked about. This is why we're going to be talking about it in the next video in 2 days. Now here's the bigger one, the bigger unspoken one. It was the unrest among soldiers. So many of the Continental soldiers had not been paid. So why hadn't they been paid? Because they didn't have anything to pay them with. Remember? Debt. They had so much debt. Our country has so much debt. Sometimes we question how we can even pay for it. It's more than we spend on defense. It's more than we spend on almost health. Holy cow. Okay, so during this time, there is no currency. They can use the British pound because they know that it has some value. Not really well accepted in the United States just because, or in the United Colonies, because of the British being kicked out. So, and there was no currency at all. So some of the states actually started to produce it, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So the soldiers are not being paid. So they go home and they still have to pay for their land. Well, we have no money to pay. So how are we going to pay for our house? How are we going to pay for our food? We just fought the American Revolution. What the heck? This is not right. We want to be paid. There began to be what's called the Newburgh conspiracy, 1783. This is where officers were actually considering to revolt against Congress. Yeah, that's right. George Washington had to defuse the crisis with a powerful speech. That's all he had. He had a powerful speech. He didn't really have much anything behind him because, again, the states had to rule on certain things. There was no currency. So George Washington was the linchpin that basically held the whole government together. And yes, you might be saying, well, is that why he was called president or made president after? Yes. Yes, it was. He was literally an iconic figure that kept the colonies together. Without him, it would not have happened. Would not have happened. I can say that 99% chance it would not have happened. Now, there might have been another figure like him, but at this point, there was only him when it came to real figures that could actually do it. But this did not stop that there's a lot of animosity that's happening, a lot of rebellion that's starting. You have people that are in the country that cannot afford to live. Now, there's one thing that they start using as currency, and that's alcohol. Well, what happens if you start to regulate the alcohol? You don't want them to be able to trade alcohol, and so you put a cease and desist basically on all alcohol. People are going to start fighting back. So let's talk about, before we get there, because that's going to be more Wednesday, let's talk about the Annapolis Convention. This is in 1786. It's a warning sign. A small meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, was held to discuss trade issues. Only 5 states were represented. Again, you need 9 out of 13 to agree on it. If not even 9 showed up, you can't pass a law. So at this convention, they wanted to have a discussion about how to do trade and how to work it out. However, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison used it to call for a larger convention to address the broader national problems. This is the only reason why the Annapolis Convention did not turn into a complete disaster, because they didn't say we need to vote on something, much like some of them wanted to do. They said, hey, we need to have a bigger convention, a third convention, a continental convention. Actually, it was called the Constitutional Convention. But we're not going to get in that till next week. And we're not going to talk about the Shays Rebellion until Wednesday. We have so much to talk about. We're not going to be talking about funding the government until Wednesday. So even though the Articles of Confederation were a great thing at the time, they were not sufficient to run a country, which is why they had to move forward with starting a new government and having a full constitutional convention. the Constitution, to write an actual document, to take the place of the articles, and to run this country. So, I hope you get something out of this. This is a great time. This is going to be amazing. The next few weeks, you're going to love, because we're going to talk about everything that designed this country. We're also going to talk about ways of making you smarter than the average person when it comes to arguments about the early years of the United States. We're going to tell you all the ins and outs, all the debates and discussions that are going on. We're going to give you the information. You're going to be able to take on, historians, teachers. Now, you go against a historian, you're going to get a lot more than what I'm going to be teaching you, because there's a lot of information there. But you can at least hold your own ground against most of the ignorance that we have in the United States about the birth of the nation. This is definitely a time to listen up and to grab your book, grab your textbook, read through it, because I'm probably going to cover a fifth of what's in there, because there's just too much. But we're going to go through how it's all structured, the timeline of everything. And you don't need to know names and dates, but you need to know how things happen and as they go. So stay tuned. So excited to tell you more. Until next time, take care, everyone. Have a great day. Bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.